This conference will now be recorded.
How long are you away for, Nanda?
Just for a week. But I had started about this presentation, and there's nothing worse than being watched by your peers, is there?
I'm hoping you're all going to be friendly and enthusiastic.
Yeah. Have you got a lot of people signed up, interested?
Yes, about 27 if they all turn up.
Oh, that's good.
It's quite good. It's the highest take-up we've had.
Right.
So obviously they know Fiona's a fascinating speaker, and they know you will be, Nanda.
Oh, that's it.
Well, it's difficult to pitch it right, isn't it? Getting, the level of, you don't want to teach people to suck eggs, but you don't want to grab everything off with too complicated stuff.
Yeah.
True. How's life, Nanda? Is it busy? Are you busy?
I am fairly busy, thank you. Yeah. Yes. What about you?
Don't ask.
bit too quiet for you.
Very, yeah.
Oh.
In fact, actually, I might come and talk to you about that, because one of the other researchers has suggested to me, because I was complaining. I was saying, how the business model has changed for me, because can you just put 2 people into this group? Yeah. And she said, why don't you team up with some other independent recruiters, so that you can between you can offer global, nationwide, or some sort of coverage. And I said, oh, well, then, you're only as good as the other people. And she said, well, no, you'd go to your trusted researchers and you'd ask them if they've got trusted recruiters, and then approach them that way. Well, do you think that's a good idea?
Well, there's certainly. I mean, obviously, if it's anywhere around Nottingham and so on, I would always use you. But I don't tend to do that patch very often. But I've got 1 or 2 people I use who I would trust fully, and so I definitely could recommend. Yeah.
But would you think it's a good idea to suggest to them that we get together, so that when someone comes to us and says we've got a project that's all over the country, like that's what's happening now, 2 of this and 2 of that, that we could sort of offer the whole package? Do you think that might be an idea?
I think that would be good, especially because the few people that I know are very sort of seasoned experts, and you know that you do a good job, and as long as you're working with people like that, which invariably people on the ICG are very experienced, then I think you'd have a strong offer.
Yeah. Okay. It's something to think about. I might tap into you when you come back from your holes, if that's all right.
Yeah, because I've had very bad experiences with recruiters, in terms of people recruiting for me where I have no say, and it can be very, some of these big London agencies. I think it's
yeah. What do you think, Fiona? Do you think it's a
I think it sounds a good idea, and I think people would benefit from a one-stop shop if they were doing something across the country. But that sense of experts in, I guess, particular regions could be very appealing, couldn't it?
Okay. Right. I will approach people. Just give it a couple more minutes, Fiona, and then launch. Another 24 to arrive.
Yes, it's not like me to be early.
What for?
It's not like me to be early ever for anything.
I'm impressed.
Well, usually I was just thinking that the tech, because I'm on my iPad and everything, I thought, well, I better just check it's all working.
Yeah. This is how it feels when you're moderating, I guess, waiting for everyone to turn up and hoping they've got the right tech to be responding.
Yes, there's always that last minute struggle when you can never quite, people seem to find settings on their computers you've never seen before. However much you prepare for it, it's hard to cover all the eventualities.
Yeah, well, actually, I nearly had a heart attack because my computer started freezing, and I thought, oh. So I just literally switched it off and on again, and then it said preparing Windows, and I thought, please don't start.
No, not now. Don't do an update now.
It didn't. Hi, everybody. So anyway, luckily I managed to get back in.
Good.
I had one recently where nobody seemed to have turned up, and I had about 4 clients watching, and I was panicking like mad. It was face to face, but they were all waiting
Yeah.
outside the door. Luckily, thank goodness.
Okay, people have started arriving. So shall I kick off, Fiona?
Oh,
You okay?
okay.
Yeah, okay. Right. So I'd like to welcome everyone to this very interesting sounding talk by Fiona and discussion about desk research. And just to say that Knowledge Share, today's Knowledge Share is kindly sponsored by eTabs. eTabs bringing cutting edge automated charting for your projects in PowerPoint and Google Slides. So I'm going to hand over the reins to Fiona and say, here you go. Make present.
Thank you very much. Just bear with me a second. Can I just check you can see that okay? Is everyone seeing my screen? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. My name is Fiona Silver, and for those of you who don't know me, I run a company called Silver Research Services, and one of the services that I offer is desk research, and that's what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. So the 3 things really I wanted to impart this afternoon is, first of all, to give an understanding of how you might want to use desk research to optimise your primary research. I think it has quite a key role to play in optimising primary research. I also want to use it to enthuse people about desk research. I do think that desk research is something that tends to be undervalued within the research world, and I think it's something worth having up your sleeves in your research toolbox to answer some of the questions. And the main part of what I'm going to be trying to do is to give some very practical tips about how to do desk research if you are undertaking some sort of desk research project. And actually, it could be a desk research project that's not related to your career. It could be something in your personal life, because some very similar rules probably apply, I think.
Fiona, can I just jump in? I'm sorry, I forgot to say, if anyone's got any questions, please can they put them in the chat, and then we'll do those at the end. Okay, thank
perfect.
you.
Okay, thank you. So the 3 sections of the presentation. First, a fairly brief section just looking at the basics of desk research. What is it? Why might you want to use it? And when might it be applicable to use? Then the main section is my 13 top tips. So this is really covering the process and how you might like to organise yourself if you're doing desk research, and perhaps a couple of tools that you might like to have a look at. And finally, I'll be looking at the hot topic of AI in the context of desk research. Some of the things that I've tried over the last few weeks and months that seem to be helpful that you might like to have a look at too. So a relevant question at this point might be, why should we be listening to you about this? I've got a fairly broad-ranging market research career. I've worked in insight functions at BP in Nissan Europe, and I started my career in quantitative client service at Kantar Millward Brown. But my first interest in desk research came when I was working for a company called IGT. You might be a bit less familiar with IGT than some of the other brands that I've worked for, but they're one of the leading providers of technology to the gaming industry. And I was working for them as an international planner. So I was helping them to identify countries where there might be a market for a national lottery, and also to work with some of their customers in their national lottery bids. And this is really where I first began to understand how useful desk research can be, and really how broad the information can be that you can collect using desk research. My main business focus as a freelancer is on research analysis and communications. So about half of my business comes from doing desk research projects, and the other half is in helping agencies and clients to analyse and report qual and quant findings. So if you find yourself overwhelmed with analysis and reporting requirements, I'm somebody who you can bring in and help you out with that. But I'd very much say that it's something I'm still learning about. So if anybody has got some additional tips on desk research they'd like to share this afternoon, I'd be extremely interested in hearing about those too. As I alluded to at the start, I think desk research is very much a Cinderella of the research world. It doesn't tend to focus on, come across on conference platforms or in research blogs or anything like that. I think it sounds like something that's a bit old-fashioned, not particularly exciting. maybe sitting in some dusty library with some very ancient computer trying to dig through lots of data. I think definitely the terminology around desk research doesn't help that. So, the idea of a desk research, or it's sometimes also called secondary research, none of that sounds particularly exciting or motivating, I don't think. So one of the things I did ahead of today was to put a description of desk research into our new friend ChatGPT and ask it to come up with some alternative ways of describing this particular activity. It came up with a few different options, but there's some I particularly liked. So I particularly liked the idea of knowledge reconnaissance, and I also like the idea of data discovery. I think they sound much more active, more exciting. They've also got that sense of being mission-based. So this is not an activity you're doing just because it's interesting. It's got an objective behind it, and you should be approaching it with that mission focus of what you're actually trying to get to at the end. They also sound, I think, more creative sounding, and I think there's room for quite a lot of creativity, in fact, in desk research. It's about thinking very broadly about how you might be able to get hold of the information that you're looking for. And it's got that sense of preparation as well. So often desk research is a preparation for something else. It could be a preparation for some primary research. It could be a preparation for an activity like business planning. So I like those two phrases, and I think they're closer to the reality in some ways than that expression, desk research. So I might be campaigning for a change of title to something more exciting like knowledge reconnaissance, I think. Let's just go through the basics. I'm sure most of you know this already, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page with this. What is desk research? Well, very simply, it's about using information that's being collected by someone else or another organisation to answer some research objectives. And in my case, I'm using published information. Mainly it's free information, but sometimes it is paid for information. What I'm not doing in the work that I do is sort of pretending to be somebody else to get the information. I'm not doing any sort of covert competitor analysis or something like that. I'm using publicly available information. And this technique has some very definite pros and cons. So I think the most obvious pro really is it's likely to be cheaper than doing some primary research. You obviously haven't got the cost of the field work, you haven't got setup costs. It's likely to cost less money. And I think if you're looking at a project where the budget is quite limited, maybe it could only stretch to, say, a few depth interviews, then you might like to consider whether desk research might be a better option. It might be that you're able to uncover information that will give them a broader spectrum of information than they could get from quite a limited primary research project. For similar reasons, it also tends to be quicker. Again, you've got no setup, you've got no fieldwork costs. It is a very labour-intensive process, but nevertheless, you will normally do desk research quicker than you could do a primary research project. We've also got fantastic online accessibility these days to lots and lots of information. So there's a great deal of information out there to go to. And perhaps slightly controversially, I would say sometimes you're a bit less biased if you're doing desk research. If you're doing a primary research project, you're very invested in the methodology you've decided to use. I think if you're looking at somebody else's approach or methodology, you can be quite objective in thinking about what the pros and cons are of that different approach. It's also got some distinctive disadvantages. Often the information that you will find will not be exactly tailored to your needs. So maybe, for example, you're interested in a particular target market, you might be able to find something close, but you can't find an exact match. Or you might find that the quality of the information is either unclear, you can't quite see exactly how it's been generated, or that the quality is in fact poor. And I would particularly be cautious about any survey that you're using that looks like it's being created for PR purposes. Sometimes that quality of that information may not be that great. It can be hard to find very, very up to the moment information. So if you're doing a project whereby you're looking for some information that's very, very timely, it could be that primary research might be a better option. And the information you're going to be collecting is not going to be exclusive to you. It's going to be open to anybody to find. If you can find it, so can other people. However, I think that's not such a big a disadvantage as you might think. I think the fact that it's publicly available doesn't necessarily mean that the information has been sensibly looked at, that has been analysed, it's been actually acted upon. So I think you can still have a lot of very valuable information, even though it might not be exclusive to you.
Fiona,
finally,
I'm sorry, Fiona, sorry. Can I ask Stephen and Barbara to mute themselves, please? Because we can hear talking and background noise. Thank you. And Barbara, please could you mute yourself?
thank you.
Thank
And
you.
finally, you're not always guaranteed that what you're looking for is going to be there, and you can be surprised. Sometimes you think something very obvious should be there and you can't find it. And sometimes you might find that something you thought would be really tricky is actually available to find. So there's no guarantees around desk research. It is a bit like looking for treasure. Sometimes you have some really rich finds, and sometimes it can be more difficult than you expect. So be aware that that might be the case. When you might use desk research, it's got all sorts of different use cases. This is some of the ones that I've come across. So as I said, you can use it for primary research optimization, and I think this is a really good use of desk research. You can use it to make sure that when you're doing primary research, you're really focusing on the knowledge gaps rather than just going over the same ground and covering things that you could find more cheaply in another way. It can also help you to optimize in the sense of finding the right consumer language, so that your questions or discussion guide is written in a way that really reflects how people talk about the subject. It might help you to identify a better sample, and it might help you to find out what kind of methodology might be most effective. It's also very good at competitor analysis. I think if you're in a marketing department working for a brand, you can become very blinkered and focused on your own particular activity. And desk research is a quick and easy way of having a look to see what the competition are doing. And you can find some really valuable information about competitor activity and strategy from publicly available information. Like a lot of research, it's often to do with understanding consumer behaviour. Can be great at looking at actual sales and things like that. If your primary research objective is more about understanding motivation, it might be less good. It might be you're better off trying to do some sort of qualitative approach, for example. You might be lucky, you might find something online, but that's not guaranteed. Also used very frequently for business planning, and linked to that often looking at market sizing or trying to forecast what the market might do in the future. And I'm going to be looking at this as one of my tips in a second, so I'll come back to that one. Sometimes used for new products and feasibility, just trying to understand whether a new product might be successful, but like I was doing when I worked for IGT. And also more generally looking at future trends. I've also used it in the context of due diligence, so when companies are being acquired, looking to see whether it looks like the value of that company is being appropriately priced. But overall, there's a sense that desk research is about learning from others. It's about being canny in your use of information. It's about not repeating what's already out there freely for the picking. It's almost like a kind of knowledge recycling. And that might be another way of describing it, which I think is very applicable. It's about being effective in your use of resources that are already there. What kind of sectors can you do it in? Well, everything really. These are some of the ones that I've worked on. Everything from fairly macro level subjects like digitisation, all the way through to very specific things like paddle boards. Some of the ones that are easiest to research, I would say, are either ones that are very current, they're in the news a lot, so there's quite often some good information available, or ones that are of interest to government. So things like education, things like transport, often have really good quality information around them because they're of interest to government, and the likes of the ONS and their equivalents in other markets tend to cover those sort of things really well. However, even some of the ones that are a bit more niche can also have some really valuable information. So I've put one here that I did during COVID, which was for personal safety apps. So this is a company who wanted to get into the idea of personal safety apps. So these are apps that you give to your workers if they're in some kind of dangerous situation. So maybe they're going into somebody else's home, or they're going into a remote part of the world. You give them an app and it gives them the option to SOS for help or to get online advice and that kind of thing. It shows you if they've fallen over or something like that. And the company I was looking at said, we want to go into this market, tell us about the competitive environment and try and help us to understand what kind of sales we might be able to expect. And my response to them initially was, well, I think the competitive element will be straightforward. I think the sales element might be a little bit harder. But as it turned out, this was a market where the Competition Commission had recently done a report because of a potential concern over monopolisation. And so there was some really good detailed information about the personal safety market, including some very confidential information that was available publicly too. So you could never quite tell, as I said, sometimes the things you think will be easy to research are difficult, and sometimes the reverse can be true too. So before I move on to my 13 tips, just a sort of general piece of advice. This is probably the big overarching thing I would say to you if you're doing desk research. And it's that you don't approach desk research in the same way that I might think about researching my next family holiday. So by what that I mean, you don't kind of think, well, oh, I'd quite like to go to Portugal, and where could I go to? I could go to Porto, I could go to the seaside. Oh, my friends mentioned that great restaurant in Porto, let's have a look at that. Oh, she said Croatia was good too, let's go and have a look at that. That kind of random searching, kind of following your nose approach has a couple of problems with it. First of all, it's very inefficient, and so you'll find yourself, if you're not careful, spending absolutely hours and hours going backwards and forwards on it. But it also means you might miss things out. So it pays to be a bit more structured and a bit more organised in how you approach it. So let's move on to my 13 tips. So number one is linked to what I've just said, really, which is to be systematic. Have a process for how you're going to approach this. So you're going to go through a series of steps, something along the lines of defining exactly what your research questions are, identifying perhaps what potential sources you might be able to use, and that's probably going to develop as you go along, but you might have an initial list of places you want to look. You might have started to evaluate your sources and think about what some of the pros and cons of those different sources might be. You're then going to go through a collection phase, an analysis phase, and then synthesizing that information to present it back in whatever format is appropriate to the project. So being quite systematic, having that process at the back of your mind that you're going to go through. Number two, though, is to try and think broadly. As I said, I think desk research has quite a lot of room for creativity. Don't just get stuck doing the same thing or the same sources. Try and think of different ways of approaching the same information. This is your opportunity to unleash your inner detective. So you can be creative about your sources. So, for example, if you were asked to research a competitive environment for a particular brand, you might look, first of all, obviously, at the website, you might look at the annual report, you might look at social media, etc. But you might also look more broadly at things like if the suppliers of a company have published anything. You'll quite often find that suppliers of brands are a bit less discreet than the brands themselves. So maybe that brand you're researching has had a recent media campaign, and the media company has decided to put themselves in for a prize, and as part of their submission, they've included details about the creative brief and the marketing strategy they're working to. Or maybe the chief executive of that company has done a detailed interview with a trade publication. Trying to approach the same kind of question from lots of different angles and trying to find the sort of hidden nuggets of information. You can also be broad in terms of thinking of your search terms. So there'll often be a couple of really obvious ones to start searching with up front, but you'll probably find as you go through, you think of more and more different ways in which people might be describing this particular market or this particular activity. So you can think of a range of different search terms to follow up. You can also obviously be creative in how you synthesize and report back your findings. And sometimes these projects, require lots of detail, but sometimes you can be helpful and really synthesize it down and make it very to the point in terms of what you're trying to communicate. Just because you've got that wealth of data behind it doesn't always mean it's necessary or even desirable to show all of it in the findings. And you can obviously also think about who you might collaborate with, especially if you're working on something that's quite niche, trying to find somebody who's got some background information to help you. And of course, the ICG's got some fantastic members in there with some really great information that you might like to talk to. Tip number three is to be methodical and detailed. I don't know if this says more about me and my age really than anything, but my recommendation is you don't rely on your memory when you're doing this. If you find yourself sort of going through things and noting things down, don't just rely on your memory to think, oh, I must go back and have a look at that. Keep some kind of record so you're keeping track of what you need to go back and have a look at again. Do be meticulous about the details and do try and triangulate as much as possible what you find. If you find something, see if you can find anything else that might either back it up or refute it. Tip number 4 is to think critically about the information that you see. My golden rule is if you find something surprising, it's either something really interesting or it's something that's not true. So anything that really stands out is worth being particularly careful about checking out. Do watch out for any obvious signs of bias. As I said, if you've come across surveys that are done primarily for PR purposes, I'd be a little bit cautious. And actually, if you find information that seems very, very confirmatory, so you feel like you're reading the same thing again and again with a bit of difference, it might be that it's all come from the same base source. And in that case, it's very much worth trying to find what that base source was, because quite often there can be a bit of a game of Chinese whispers with that kind of thing, where as the information gets passed on from source to source, it loses something in translation, and maybe what the information reflects is not always accurately given. So if you're sort of getting that sense of hearing the same thing again and again, do try and find out what the original source of the information was. And number 5 is to have a good understanding of what the underlying background is behind the project. That's an obvious advantage, I think, with any research projects, but it's particularly pertinent to desk research. First of all, because it leads to more accurate and efficient searching, but also because of the kind of treasure hunting nature of desk research. It might be that while you're trawling through and looking for some of their objectives from the desk research, you also pick up some additional useful information that they might not have specifically asked you to find. So it might not be on the list of things that they've asked you to look up, but actually, because you understand the broader background, you can pass it on to them and say, look, I can see this is really relevant to what you're trying to do, and add value to your project in that way. Tip number 6 is to try and break down the objectives. So sometimes you might be given a fairly generic kind of objective, like, what is the competitive landscape in France? In which case it will pay to try and break that down into more specific questions, like who are the main competitors, what are their market size, what are their USPs, who are their target audience, etc. And by asking those more specific questions, you're likely to get a more detailed and granular response to your inquiries. Sometimes clients will do this for you and you will end up with a big list of questions from the start. But if they don't, it's worth trying to work with your clients to just break that down into a bit more detail to make sure you've got that detailed level of understanding of what they're looking for. And that will then help you with your searching as well. Tip number 7 is to check what they already know. Not all companies are that great at keeping a database of what they already have in terms of things like market reports, sales data, previous research, etc., especially from outside the department. So if you're looking for something, worth talking to your contacts to make sure they have really checked to make sure none of this information is already held within the organisation somewhere. Tip number 8 is a rather pragmatic project management type tip. So this is about setting staging posts. So what you can find with desk research is you can get very bogged down in a particular aspect. You follow these tunnels of information and you can spend hours and hours trying to find something. And if you're not careful, you'll run out of time. You won't be able to cover all the things that you've been asked to cover. So it's worth having an idea in your head about how much time you want to allocate against particular parts of the brief. So maybe you say, I'm going to look at this aspect for a day, and then I'm going to spend 2 days on this one, and so on, just to make sure that you're going to get to your end point by whenever your delivery date is. Sometimes it can be worth trying to negotiate a day or two up front, just to say to your customer, look, give me a day or two just to get a sense of what's out there and how much I might be able to find from it and how much time it's worth spending on it. And that way you can have a better estimate as to how many days you should put against it. It can be hard to know when to call a halt to searching, but sometimes you'll definitely get a sense of you're hearing the same things again and again. And if you start to get to that sense, it's probably time to move on to the next objective. The searching can be infinite, but you need to have a deadline somewhere. And so if you start to hit a lot of repetition, that's probably the moment to move on. Tip number 9 is to follow what I call information trees. So what I mean by this is if you're following a particular line of inquiry, you will probably get to a point where you're looking at something and you'll find other things that you wish to pursue. So you're reading an article and it mentions another study that you want to follow up, or it suggests a search term that you want to look at. So as I said before, it's important to keep a note of what these things you want to go back and check out are. So make sure you have that systematic process to go back and follow those lines of inquiry to make sure you cover all the available information that you can do. Tip number 10 is to think about the search terms. So you'll develop a list of search terms and you'll probably add to that as you go along. And you need to keep a record of what you've searched under just to make sure you are being comprehensive in what you're looking at. You might also want to look at some of the advanced search techniques that you can use on search engines. I've included a link here to some of the ones on Google search. But this is things like using quotation marks if you want to find a very specific phrase, or using commands like and or to cut down the search responses that you get. So you can be quite clever about how you use your search terms to find more specifically what you're looking for. So do check out some of the advanced search functions to see if they can be helpful to you. Tip number 11 is to note your sources. It may or may not be the case that your customer actually wants to know up front what your sources are, but you certainly need to keep a record of it because they might well come back and say, where did that data come from? Is it reliable? What's the source? So you need some sort of way of keeping a track of where you got your information from. Obviously, you can use good old pen and paper for that. I'm sure you could also use digital whiteboards. But something you might like to have a look at is Trello. So this is an example of what Trello looks like. It's essentially a digital version of a list making function. And I've got an example here, which I've set something up for looking at a digital in education type project. So I've got a list of all my different keywords. I've got a list of the sources that I'm using. I've got a list of competitors that I'm beginning to develop. And as you can see, if you look on the right-hand side under Purple Mash, it's got those lines. If you click on that card, it opens up the card fully and it shows you all the information that's about Purple Mash. You have the option to highlight things, to note other people, and you can use this in a collaborative way. So you can give access to your board to other people. So for example, if you were working on a desk research project with somebody else, maybe they're covering one country, you're doing another, you have the option then of commenting on each other's Trello board and telling them other things that they might like to look at or commenting on that. It's available as a freemium model, and I think that the free version is absolutely fine for this purpose. So that might be a nice digital option to have a look at if you don't want to do it the old-fashioned way. Tip number 12, if you're doing lots of desk research, is what I've said to hone your tools. And what I really mean by that is to make a note of what works. So keep notes of those useful sources that you find, useful sites, useful tools. You know, maybe you find a good tool for getting through paywalls, something like that, or you find a really good source of statistics that you want to use. Make sure you keep a note of them so that you can use them again next time. And again, worth finishing the circle in terms of reflecting on the process. So when you've done a project, what was it that worked and what didn't, and what can you learn about that for next time? And my final tip is about market sizing and market forecasting. This could really be a whole other presentation all of its own. Desk research obviously isn't the only way of market sizing, but it's something that sometimes is used to contribute to market sizing. And often there's not one single solution to how to do this. It varies very much by market and what information is available. But it's often worth considering trying to do it from a number of different angles. So you might like to consider doing a top-down approach. So for example, if you were looking at cat food market, you could try and work out how many cats there are in the country and how many households that represents and gradually move down that way. Or you could do it from the bottom up. You could sort of say, well, each cat eats this much food each week at an average price of this, and build it up from the bottom. You could also look to see if there's any good third-party estimates out there. Often there are existing reports on particular markets, and they very often have estimates of market size and forecasts for the next few years. They can be a bit black box. It can be a little bit hard to work out how they have gone about creating these sizings, estimates and forecasts. You might be able to purchase them at a reduced price. If you're only interested in part of the report, you might be able to negotiate and get it for a slightly cheaper price than the whole report. Or you might like to check out what's available at the British Library. So the British Library has a number of different market reports, including by the likes of Mintel. You can look at those reports for free in the British Library, And you can also export them to a limited degree from the library itself, so take some elements of it out again. So again, it's worth having a look to see whether you can actually find that information in the British Library for free if you think you're going to have to pay for it. And sometimes actually the promotional material behind these reports also includes some information you might be able to use. You might want to look and see whether your estimates look sensible by trying to anchor it to something else. Is there anything you can learn from adjacent categories, what's happened in other countries, any other past experience they might have had? And you want to make sure that any estimates you come up with give you a sensible market share. If you've kind of estimated a sales figure, you want to make sure that when you look at that against any competitor sales figures, it's looking like it's going to be a sensible market share. If you're working on something really niche, it can be worth trying to find an expert in that field. It could be that there's not a lot of published information out there on some very bespoke industrial machinery or something like that, in which case it might be worth trying to track down the 1 or 2 experts in that area who might be able to help you and at least give you some sense of whether your estimates look sensible or not. So it's not a science. There are definitely some limitations around it, and I think you have to be very clear with this, how you've created your estimates, and communicate how you've done that and the limitations potentially of that to your customers too. It can look more scientific, I think, than it sometimes is. So just be careful about how you're doing this. I think it's fine to provide estimates, but you just need to be very conscious and aware of how you've gone about doing that and check that they look sensible. So finally, I was going to look at desk research and AI. This is something that's pretty new to me. I'm sure it's pretty new to a lot of people. And this is definitely not a comprehensive look at AI. This is very much the things that I found helpful over the last couple of weeks and months, mainly using ChatGPT and a little bit of Google Bard. So a couple of things I think I found it really helpful for. I think it's quite good as a brainstorming companion. So if, like me, you're mainly working from home, you haven't got somebody easily available to brainstorm with, it can be really good at just giving you some top level information. So I did an example here where I'm thinking, well, I'm doing this research on the electric bike market, and I want to think about what the main reasons are why people might use an electric bike. So I can start to think about what other things I might want to search for. And it comes up with a very plausible sounding list of reasons why people might choose an electric bike. They might use it for commuting, they might use it for fitness and health, environmental benefits, and so on. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that what I'm not saying is that this is definitively the most common reasons why people are using an electric bike. What I'm saying is it's a good brainstorming tool. It's a good other brain to access when you're looking at these kind of general information. It's also really good at comparing written information. So in this example here, this is from Google Bard. I've asked it to have a look at 2 different news articles. So these are ones on the recent news item about sewage from the water companies. And I've asked it to look at these 2 articles and to tell me, or to give me a table comparing and contrasting the 2 articles. So it's on a really nice table here, telling you the title, the date, the author, a summary of the findings, what the key points were that were made in the article, and the opinion that underlaid it. So a nice little summary there might save you some time if you're thinking, okay, this looks like it's going to be similar to something I've already read. Let me just see if it's got anything new to add. Could even be a good way of presenting information back to your customer potentially. And AI is also really good if you use it in a very iterative way. So what I mean by that is if you ask it a question, it produces something, it's not quite right, you think it could be improved, it's always worth going back and trying to refine it or be more specific about what you're looking for. So that in that example before, I went back and said, okay, just tell me what the key main differences are between these 2 articles. And it's very easily highlighted: difference in tone, difference in perspective, difference in who it's quoted, and the differences in its source. And again, it can be really good at giving that kind of information from written material. You can also use it to brainstorm your keywords. So here I've asked Bard to come up with some hashtags associated with digital education. It's come back with a very plausible sounding list of popular hashtags. These may or may not be the most popular hashtags, which we'll come on to in a second. But as a way of just generating some ideas to look at, I think this is a good place to start. The worst that's going to happen is that you're going to search on some of these hashtags and not find very much. but a good opening position to start with. And it can be very good at summarizing written information. So if you've got a lot of text, it can very easily summarize that down into a paragraph. Now, there are some physical limits on how much you can cope with, and ChatGPT is curiously coy about telling you exactly what those limits are. But I think we're really talking about hundreds of words rather than thousands of words. So if you find yourself with a very big document, you might end up having to shorten that down into shorter pieces for it to work properly. But it can summarize information that can be really handy if you want to have a sense of whether something could be worth reading in full, for example. But do be cautious, it may include in that summary information from its general knowledge store rather than what's specifically in the subject, in the article you're looking at. So if it's critical that the summary is absolutely a reflection of what's in the article itself, you will need to double check that to make sure that it is accurate. And this is possibly a little bit lazy, I think, but sometimes I find myself trying to summarize something and I've got a very awkward sentence in what I'm writing. Can't immediately see what a good way of rephrasing it can be. ChatGPT is very good at just giving you nice, simple, straightforward sentences. So I put my convoluted sentence into ChatGPT. It comes out with a nice, straightforward sentence that sounds a lot better. It's definitely not going to be high literature, but very, very pragmatic for the purposes of kind of business. Where you do need to be cautious, though, is using this kind of generative AI in terms of finding factual information. And if you look at the homepage for ChatGPT, Google Bard, there are still warnings on there about the fact that it might create inaccurate information. And there have already been some high-profile situations where that inaccuracy has come to the fore. So very famously on launch day for Bard, they published a question that Bard got the answer wrong to and thereby wiped $100 billion off the price of their shares. And there was also an issue, I think, just last week where a lawyer tried to use ChatGPT for his citations, and it turned out that ChatGPT came back with a lot of citations that just simply didn't exist. There's a very good ICG webinar from a couple of weeks ago where they talked about AI and they talked about the probabilistic nature of it. It's not the same as a search engine. It can be quite seductive in terms of feeling like it's a search engine, and obviously the responses it gives are very plausible, but it's not a search engine, and you need to be very, very cautious about using it for this factual information. If you don't believe me, you can try it out. If you try putting into ChatGPT a question like, tell me some academic papers on the subject of this, it'll come back with very plausible sounding papers, but you will struggle to find those papers in reality, and you might even struggle to find the publications that it says that they're from. So it's not a great source of factual information at the moment. I'd say Bard is slightly better than ChatGPT, but for my money, for the time being, I'm going to be sticking to search engines for that kind of purpose. But definitely AI has got lots of potential, and I'm sure it's going to get better and better as time goes on. So it's a subject I'm going to be following very closely over the next few months. So that's all I had to say. I wonder if there are any questions.
Yes, Nanda's asked one. Are there any particular tips for B2B where info tends to be harder to come by?
In some ways, I think B2B, it depends on the particular sector, I think. I mean, obviously things like trade associations can be good. I'm not sure necessarily the B2B is harder. It's more limited perhaps in the number of sources, but often you find there are sources that know a great deal about that particular subject. I don't think there's a particular rule of thumb for B2B, but I think things like trade associations are often quite good and worth talking to them in person rather than just seeing what they've got on their websites, I would say.
Thank you. And Stephen asks, any suggestions as to how to price projects or desk components in a primary project?
Yeah, it is hard. I mean, where possible, I have to say, I either try and price by the day or to give a kind of range and say, I think it's something like 5 to 7 days. I think it's worth asking, if possible, to get that day up front and so saying, give me a day to have a look at it and see how much info is out there. And then I might be able to give you a more accurate answer. But I also, I mean, I try to be very honest with clients. I'll sort of say to them, actually, I've said it's going to be 5 days. If I'm looking for 2 days and I've run out of stuff to tell you, I'll come back and admit that. Or if it feels like I've got 5 days and there's still an awful lot more to come to, you know, I'll come back to you and say, look, if you're prepared to pay a little bit more, I think there's more nuggets of information out there. But it can be a very long, how long is a piece of string type thing. I think you start to get a feel for it after a time, but it's not an exact science, I don't think.
Thank you. Dan says, that was really useful. Thank you very much. I also like the idea of a desk research rebrand, but why do you think more people aren't doing this sort of work, given its obvious value and the wealth of brackets free information available?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I wonder whether AI will regenerate it in some ways, because I think AI puts a whole new spin on it and allows you to be even more effective with it. I think it's, you know, there's just a lack of excitement around it, isn't there? There's no new research tech. I put a question on the forum and said, is there any specific AI related to desk research? Because I'd be really interested. I don't know quite what that would look like, but I'd be interested in it. And, you know, I didn't hear that there wasn't a thing. So there's just a sort of lack of excitement. And I think it sort of feels a little bit like something that everyone should be able to do. You know, we all know how to use a search engine. And so there's a bit of an implication that anybody can do it and it doesn't really have any skill behind it. And I think we can all do it to a certain extent, but I think it's something you also get better with experience. So yeah, I'm hoping to rebrand it, as I said.
Stephen says, sorry if already covered as I had to take a phone call, but which, if any, proprietary sources should we be tapping into, e.g. LexisNexis, Mintel, etc.?
It varies very much depending on the topic, I think. I mean, I'd like to know, I'd be very interested in if people could tell me more about that business, because I wonder sometimes about the quality of what you see. I mean, in principle, buying a paid for resource could make sense, because effectively what you're doing is syndicating that research amongst a number of buyers. So it makes sense that you would think that you would get good value information potentially from it. But it's all a little bit too black box from my point of view. I think I'd like to understand more about exactly how they're sourcing information. I mean, I tend to stick to the ones that are better known, like Mintel, and also because it's easier to get access to them sometimes through things like the British Library. But again, I'd sort of take any hints on that, really. It's hard to know exactly who's got the best quality. Sometimes you might not have much choice, and if it's something very specific, your options might be fairly limited anyway.
Thank you. And Linda says, I'm pleasantly surprised because I've only done it a couple of times and wasn't sure if I was doing it, quote, right, but I loved it. It reassured me that I did to it well. And
Good.
Sylvia says, how do you manage clients' expectations? What do you say to make sure that they understand that you might not be able to find all the answers to their questions?
I think you just have to be honest about what the process that you're going through. I think sometimes there's a bit of a sense that customers think that there's some magic piece of information that you've got access to that they don't, and that's not really the case. It's public, generally speaking, it's publicly available information. What you're giving them is the benefit of your experience of doing the process and to some extent your knowledge of what's out there. But it's not that there's some sort of magic information tree that you've got access to that they don't. So I think just being open with them about, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm hoping to find, this is what my experience is suggesting I might find, but you know, this is the nature of the beast. You know, you won't necessarily be able to find exactly what it is you're looking for.
Thank you. Barbara says, do you use any brackets more specific tools next to ChatGPT and Bard, e.g. for analysis, transcribing, summarizing, or creation of PowerPoint decks that have been useful for you?
To be honest, I think ChatGPT has probably been the most useful tool in terms of being such a broad array of different ways in which you can use it to manipulate written findings. So the example I gave, we're looking at the 2 different news articles. I didn't know you could do that until about 2 weeks ago, and I saw somebody had done it, that kind of thing. And there'll be more of that thing coming through. I'm trying to get better at understanding the prompts and understanding the best way to prompt to get better answers. But I'm not really aware of anything more than you might find from primary research in terms of, you know, all the various different transcription tools that you can use or presentation devices. You know, they're very much the same as you might use in any research project, I think.
Thank you. Right, we've come to the end of the questions unless anybody else has got one. and nothing's appearing. So I'd like to say thank you so much to Fiona. It was really interesting. Everyone stayed, which is lovely, and was engaged. So thank you very much for giving up your time, and it was really a fascinating project. Yeah, you're getting lots of thank yous now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
Beautifully presented, it says, what somebody said.
Oh, thank you.
Just to say that this will be up on the website at some time in the not too distant future. So thanks very much, Fiona, and yeah, have a good evening. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.